All right, good morning, everybody. If you're here in person, you can feel the excitement in the room. We're very, very excited to have Colin with us this week. So my name is Mary Leonard. I'm chair of the department. If you're upstairs, come on down. We're still serving breakfast. And for those of us online, welcome. It looks to be a really fantastic grand rounds, and we'll hear about Colin in a minute. Just want to make sure everybody has the QR codes, everything for CME and MOC credit. Colin and I were part of a big national effort to address the pediatric subspecialty workforce crisis. And part of the recommendations from the National Academy that came out were about, thinking about the role of two-year fellowships. And so really excited to have Colin speak today. And then he and I were just noticing the next week, we're going to hear from the House staff, the debate. These are always wonderful events, the residents' house-wide debate. The House believes that we should shorten 3-year pediatric fellowships to 2 years. So very much looking forward to that. I know we'll have a really good turnout for that one. And then of course we'll do our land acknowledgement. We recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And so Chris Russell, who newly joined our faculty this fall, is going to introduce Colin.
Good morning. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Christopher Russell. I'm an associate professor in the Division of Hospital Medicine, and I joined in August of 2023 now, so just month 6. And it's my extreme honor and privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Colin Orr. So Dr. Colin Orr is an assistant professor in the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics at University of North Carolina. He did his undergrad at Washington University in St. Louis, went up to New York and did his medical school at Columbia University, went back a little west to Cincinnati to do his residency, and then moved to Chapel Hill in 2016 to do a NERSA primary care general pediatrics academic fellowship. And during that time, he also got an MPH. Dr. Orr has a lot of accolades, and I don't want to take up too much of his time, but I wanted to note a few things in the way we got to know each other was through the Academic Pediatric Association, where he was the recipient of the Young Investigator Award. He was also a Rapid Scholar with Dr. Mendoza's leadership. He has worked tirelessly beyond his own personal research, which is funded by a recent K-23. He also has worked with the ABP, looking at our pediatric healthcare workforce, and recently, just this month, in February, really co-led with Laurel Leslie, a supplement looking at child health, that's pediatric subspecialty workforce, and basically went through every single subspecialty and looked at where we're at right now and where we're going to be. And it's enlightening, but it's also eye-opening. And so with that, I'm really excited and to welcome and introduce Dr. Orr to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to say how honored I am to be here with y'all. There's a lot of incredible people at Stanford that I've had the opportunity to collaborate, and I never thought that I would be here in front of you, sharing my work and learning from all the great activities that y'all do. It was a really humbling experience to be able to be invited, especially for Black History Month. And so this offered an opportunity for reflection for myself as an individual and how that relates to my research agenda. And so the title of my talk was Living the Dream, Reflections on Equity in Pediatrics. And so I thought, given the month and given the theme for this grand rounds, it'd be really helpful for us to ground ourselves in some of the words spoken by Dr. King as relates to equity in America. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given its colored people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in this great vault of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and security of justice. Words that were spoken many decades ago, but I feel still resonates in present day. And I think these words and the concepts and themes that these words highlight permeate a lot of the equity discussions that we were going to have, as well as my research efforts in this space. So a little bit about me. I love DC because I love the Smithsonian's. I had a chance to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And for those, I know it's a big trip. I just haven't made that trip. I know it's a big one. It's an incredibly powerful museum. There's multiple levels, and it takes a lot of time to go through all the stories that are being told at the museum. We started on the ground floor, which is really powerful because it mimics the conditions of a sleigh trip. And so as you're walking through and you start on the bottom floor, you're walking through and you see sculptures of individuals huddled together to mimic what that journey must have been like. And that is how it starts. And then as you go up the levels, last time I was there, I'm sure there have been additions, it ends with Obama in his inauguration. And it kind of highlights the arc of the Black people in this country. A lot of progress has been made, but as we will see through some of our slides that we're going to discuss, there's a lot more that needs to be done. I am also an avid coffee drinker, trying to cut back, challenging with kids and clinical and research demands. And so wherever I go, I try to pick up a coffee mug to kind of like as a reminder of that event. And while I was there, I found one and it had Frederick Douglass on it and had a quote that I think really is central to us as pediatricians. It is easier to build strong children than repair broken men. And I think this resonates with all of us in pediatrics, but especially those of us in primary care, as we try at the earliest stages of a child's development to intervene and change that trajectory so that we're not trying to change the course once a child is a little bit older, but set them up for success early in their life. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of my academic journey. We're going to talk about equity in pediatrics, and we're going to do this through a few different lenses. I'm going to talk about my collaborations, with a lot of Stanford colleagues, and then talk about future directions and next steps because our work here is not yet done. So as Dr. Russell said, I hail from Michigan, so go blue. Great football season, yes. We're not going to worry about the sanctions that are coming from the NCAA in a few years, that's fine. We're going to enjoy this. So I left Michigan to go to WashU in St. Louis. So I left home, went from Eastern time to Central time. And it was a great opportunity. WashU was a great institution, but it was also an opportunity to see how culture informs community. St. Louis is not the same as Detroit. WashU is not the same as St. Louis. And there's a lot of interplay and a lot of communications and conversations across and between people from different communities in different parts of the world. And this is really highlighted, it started me on my equity journey of understanding how we have shared characteristics, but there are unique lived experiences that inform how we interact with the world. Decided to go to New York. So you want to talk about introductions and multiple cultures being present. There's no better place than New York City. And despite Columbia undergrad being at 116th Street, the medical school is actually at 161st Street, which is in Washington Heights, which is basically a microcosm of the Dominican Republic. So it was a great opportunity to understand and see how health is conceptualized through the families that immigrated or had strong ties to the Dominican Republic. And understanding that, and this is where I really began to understand the complexity of culture and how we classify people and how that may not always capture their lived experiences or their value system. Decided to come back closer to home and train in Cincinnati. Great experience as well. And in these clinical moments is when I really saw the disparities. And I love being a clinician, but in the back of my mind, I always thought, what are the tools can I glean in order to really impact health, both in the clinic walls and outside the clinic walls? Because health, as we know, is an interplay of the clinic walls, which is probably 16%, and then a lot of the environment outside of clinic. So how can we as physicians play a role in both of those spaces? And then it came down to UNC. I tell Mike Steiner and Corey Flower, my former and current division chiefs, I came down for the basketball, as evident by having the signed autographed basketball from Hubert Davis, which is actually a historical moment in and of itself, because he is the first Black basketball coach of UNC's program. So I thought that would be a nice thing to include as we talk about Black history and a lot of the contributions of individuals. So I'm a visual learner, so here's my conceptual diagram. So we have we are all unified under the concept of health equity. So I'm going to take you all through a journey and talk about health equity through food insecurity, which is my primary research interest, the Pediatric Workforce Project, and then end with advocacy. And I do feel a little badly ending with advocacy because I'm not an expert in advocacy, and there's amazing people like Dr. Chamberlain here who are experts in advocacy. So please bear with me if as I talk about advocacy efforts in pediatrics. So always good to start with the definition. So what is food insecurity? So it is defined as a household level economic and social condition of limited or uncertain access to food. And so how is food insecurity a health equity issue, or how are these two concepts related? Well, as you can see from this graph, the populations affected by food insecurity are vastly different in terms of the prevalence. So you can see over time that consistently the blue and orange line, which represents the Black and Hispanic populations in this country, consistently have some of the highest rates of food insecurity. And worrisome, as you look at the year 2020, we all know what happened in the year 2020. We see a sharp uptick of for food insecurity among the Black and Hispanic population, and we're not seeing that same velocity of change among other populations. So who food insecurity impacts has significant health equity considerations as we think about pediatric health. So what are some of the concerns about food insecurity in pediatric health? Well, food insecurity has to deal with access to food and nutritious food. So it stands to reason that growth will be one of the primary outcomes. So the growth in food insecurity is a very interesting concept because you can see both extremes of the weight conversation in individuals that are experiencing food insecurity. You can see obesity. You can also see failure to thrive. A lot of my work really focuses on the relationship between food insecurity and obesity. Relatedly, nutrition is a tremendous concern. If you're not having access to nutritional foods, then your nutritional status might be affected. One way that we can evaluate this in primary care using requirements from Medicaid, and thankfully this data is in our EHR, is looking at the iron status. There's also been national data using NHANES that have evaluated the overall nutritional quality of youth that are exposed to food insecurity, and we see that these children consistently have lower dietary quality relative to households that don't experience food insecurity. We know that food insecurity is related to developmental delay in a negative direction, and also has tremendous impacts for the mental health of the caregivers in the household. And as pediatricians, we know that the health of the family unit is critical to the health and development of the child. So we can see that food insecurity, despite the definition focusing on access to food, has cross-cutting implications for the health, development, and nutrition of children, and cuts across equity. So I will be spending the talk focusing on the possible relationship between food insecurity and obesity. And so this is a graph I made from data from the CDC, and a few things immediately jump out. And this is looking at the prevalence of obesity. The first thing is obesity is not equal across all populations. And when we take a little bit closer look, we see that the populations that have the higher prevalence of obesity overlap with the populations that have higher prevalence of food insecurity. So this suggests that there might be some dynamics that are occurring that might help us understand this seemingly paradoxical relationship. Again, another picture. So this is how I've begun to conceptualize how these concepts relate. And as we know, social drivers of health, they're complex. These are complex themes. These are complex factors operating at the individual level, operating within communities, and operating within the larger society. So I'm going to acknowledge the complexity of these factors. My research really is focusing on this box here, thinking about how food insecurity relates to parental feeding behaviors, how that relates to nutrition, and how that puts us, and how that can influence an individual child's risk for obesity. A shameless picture of young children, but it's also, I use this for twofold, because my kids are beautiful, and also because it kind of shows us the developmental arc that we as pediatricians and parents are experiencing as they're interacting and feeding with their child. So you can see in the picture with me and my son and me feeding a bottle, that's a very different interaction between parent, child, and food than when you get to the child in the high chair. I'm nowhere in that picture. There's just food in front of her, and she is deciding how she is interacting with this food. And so but both of these despite the differences in how the parent is interacting with the food, parental feeding behaviors are potentially at play here. So here you can see me not paying attention to my son, just holding a bottle and he's taking as much as he wants. So this is actually an example of non-responsive feeding behaviors. And why do we care about non-responsive feeding behaviors? Because non-responsive feeding behaviors suggest a mismatch between how the child is being fed and the child's actual satiety cues. So there runs a potential of overfeeding, having excess calories, which could place that child on a pathway that could increase their risk for obesity. Although not present in the photo with the child in the high chair, there's parental feeding behaviors are at play here. So this is a little bit closer to a year of age for my daughter. And you can see that I'm not in the picture, but there could be coaching behind the scenes being like, you really need to finish this, finish this, well, I think they're kidney beans on this one, finish this pasta. But you can see how these sort of pressuring feeding behaviors where the parent is in charge or leading the child's satiety cues, which as this critical phase of their life where they're trying to understand their own relationship to food, we may be interfering with that process in that period. So the takeaway from this slide, cute babies, and we need to understand parental feeding behaviors and their relationship to food insecurity at multiple time points of the child's development. Which leads me into the study of my objectives for the study I'm going to share with y'all. So I was really interested in understanding the relationship between food insecurity and feeding behaviors. And my hypothesis was that feeding behaviors, differences in feeding behaviors exist based on a household's food security status. And I thought that this was really important to understand at multiple time points. So enter Dr. Sanders in the Greenlight study. So the Greenlight study, in collaboration with Dr. Sanders and other outstanding mentors on the Greenlight team, provided an opportunity and a data set to really begin to allow us to answer this question of what are the associations of food insecurity and parental feeding behaviors at 2 and 24 months. As you all know well, Greenlight was a cluster randomized controlled trial at 4 academic sites. And so our exposure for these studies is food insecurity using the 2-item screening that is very commonly used in clinical practice. And then and the outcomes are parental feeding behaviors. For the 2-month outcomes, it's the infant feeding questionnaire. And for the 24 months, it's the childhood feeding questionnaire. And so here in this table, we are looking at the association between food insecurity and a few select parental feeding behaviors and beliefs. And so looking at the first one as an example, I pay attention to my baby when my baby seems to be telling me he or she is full or hungry. And so we see a statistically significant odds ratio where families that are experiencing food insecurity are less likely to endorse this behavior or belief, which can be broadly classified as a non-responsive feeding behavior. And then as we look at the other examples here, when my baby cries, I immediately feed him or her. Best way to make an infant stop crying is to feed him or her. I think it's okay to prop an infant's bottle to hold it in place. We all see statistically significant odds ratio of an association or belief or agreement with this statement, suggesting that there are differences at 2 months using the exposures and outcomes we talked about between food insecurity and parental feeding behaviors. So what are we learning from this? Food insecurity is associated with parental feeding styles and beliefs, associated with less responsive or non-responsive feeding behaviors, which may be associated with obesity. However, as we saw in that picture, what happens as the child grows and the autonomy between food, the interaction between the parent, all changes. So here we're looking at that same question at 24 months. Our outcome is the childhood feeding questionnaire, the CFQ. I have condensed a table to show you the most interesting outcomes. And so here we see pressure behaviors, as we talked about, forcing a child to eat past their own satiety cues. So we see that we have scores of 2.9 and 5.2 between food secure and food insecure families. This is on a 5-point Likert scale. And we see that there's a statistically significant difference between these two cohorts. And then there was also a question as part of the CFQ that really sought to see what is the family's concern about their child being overweight. And we again see a statistically significant difference between the cohorts of families identifying as food secure and food insecure. We also sought to think, so we're at 24 months, we sought to look at what are some of the anthropometric outcomes that we're seeing. And so we looked at both the child prevalence of overweight and obesity, as well as the caregiver at 24 months. And we see a non-significant difference in terms of prevalence of overweight and obesity for the child and the parent, and that's not significant. So what are we learning? So we're going through our preliminary studies, we're going through this process. In each study, we're learning something more. So food insecure parents of toddlers are more likely to pressure them to eat. We're also worried about children becoming overweight. We're not yet seeing differences in terms of anthropometric measurements at 24 months. However, we know that as children age, the prevalence of obesity does increase as well. And so in the spirit of equity, I was really interested, given the diversity of and the representation of the families in the Greenlight study, are there differences based on the population in terms of how food insecurity influences parental feeding behaviors? And so health equity has a more nuanced, or potentially has more nuanced relationship between food insecurity and obesity. So interested in understanding if all children respond to food insecurity in the same way. And the fundamental research question here is, are there differences in response to food insecurity as measured by parental feeding behaviors by a family's race or ethnicity? And so here we were able to stratify by population, and we were looking at the question stem is how best to address a crying infant. So addressing an infant crying by feeding, by immediately feeding them by race, ethnicity, and food insecurity status. And again, the chart is truncated. This again was on a 5-point Likert scale, showing 1 through 3 on the y-axis, and we have our populations on the x-axis. And you can see that food insecurity does not behave similarly among all populations. The statistically significant difference that we were able to find was among the population that identified as Hispanic, where we see a difference in agreement with the statement by food insecurity status, but we're not seeing the same level of statistical significance across other populations that we include in our study. And so as we were thinking through this and trying to understand the implications of this, we really landed upon this idea of having interventions that are really tailored or informed by the lived experiences, the culture, things that are not captured in the clinical visit that need to be considered if we're truly going to design interventions to address obesity. And so this was a scoping review that I was able to lead, or I participated in. I did not lead this. A nutrition student that was working with Dr. Ammerman, one of the nutritionists at UNC, really took the lead on this, because she was really interested in understanding taking a broad overview of the literature, are there common themes and interventions designed to address obesity in racial and ethnically diverse populations? And from this study, we were able to identify 4 overarching themes that should be considered in the creation of interventions to address obesity in diverse populations. First, it's really important to think about language and the role that language plays. We say things get lost in translation, and they do. So it's really important to make sure that things are translated in a way that still has cultural meaning and significance for families and children. Thinking about food is strongly influenced by our lived environment, by our culture, and we are not in a position to say that one food type or approach would work for all, because there needs to be buy-in and a recognition that not all cultures, not all families have the same type of interactions with the same types of foods. And then understanding the family dynamics. Children live within family units. So if we were able to find a way to change the nutrition and weight trajectory of children, it really requires family buy-in. And those family members interact with people and each other in unique ways. And in the clinic environment, we're usually seeing 1, maybe 2, but that may not be the entire support network of the family. So understanding these relationships and having appropriate buy-in can be really important to the success of these different interventions. And finally, as we have increasingly diverse children and families that we're caring for in our clinic, it's really important to develop rapport, kind of recognizing that there's a lot of diversity in there. There's a lot of lived experiences of families that's unseen to us, but can influence how that family is approaching that clinical encounter. So taking the time, I know we are all stressed for time, especially in our clinical encounters, but thinking about what are the tiny steps we can do to build rapport and say, I'll speak for myself, I do not understand everything that I don't understand all of your lived experiences. I may not have as great a grasp of your culture, but I'm here to help you in the best way that I can. How can we develop rapport and work together? Okay, so moving on. A lot of information is being learned. We've done a lot of cross-sectional studies, but what about, we know that children are not static. A lot happens between 2 and 24 months. And we also know that food insecurity is dynamic. So how does dynamic exposure and experiences with food insecurity interact with the dynamic properties of a growing and developing child? So this study really sought to begin to answer that question. And so what the question that we sought to answer for this is, how does food insecurity impact the growth and nutrition of young infants during their first year of life? And how does food insecurity impact, or what is its association with maternal depression? And so this was a retrospective cohort study of children receiving care at the UNC Children's Primary Care Clinic, and data was abstracted from the EMR at 2 months, 4, 6, 9, 12. So all the standard well child checks. And an added advantage of when we created this data set was that our clinic was routinely screening for specifically food insecurity during this time point at every well child check visit. So for an individual child, if we had a complete data set, we had food insecurity data at 2, 4, 6, 9, and 12 months. And and so that allowed us to begin to answer the question of what is the longitudinal association between food insecurity and the health outcomes that we care most about. This project was funded by the APA Young Investigator Award, of which I was very thankful for, and I strongly encourage anyone and everyone to apply for that award, although I'm very, very biased with that. So some of our outcomes of interest, we collected anthropometric measures from the EMR. We also collected biochemical data. We predominantly serve a Medicaid population, and there are certain required labs that we are always strive to get. And those labs include the hemoglobin, ferritin, and we also took advantage of our routine screening for maternal depression during the 2, 4, and 6 month well child checks. So this was a great opportunity for me as a fellow to understand more longitudinal analyses. I'm not going to go through all of the specifics of that, but just to say that we adjusted for gestational age, infant race or sex, race, ethnicity, and primary insurance. If you have more questions about the analytical approach for the study, Dr. Victor Ritter is here to answer those questions. So I'm going to move on to some of our findings from that. So some of the key findings we found from this was that food insecure male infants actually had a lower weight for length Z-score than female infants, and this was statistically significant at a p-value of 0.05. We also found that repeat exposure to food insecurity might affect the nutritional status of the child as measured by their ferritin or iron status, where food insecure infants had a 14% lower log ferritin level per month of exposure to food insecurity. So we begin to see that there are cumulative effects as measured by biochemical markers to being exposed to food insecurity. And I'm sure this will be of no surprise to anyone in this audience. We also found a statistically significant association between food insecurity and maternal depression with an incidence rate of 5. So as our prior studies have really utilized quantitative methods to understand both the magnitude and the longitudinal associations between food insecurity and parental health outcomes. I think it's important for us never to lose the family voice or the family perspective. So this next set of studies really focuses on the qualitative and lived experiences of families that we were serving. And for the learners in the room thinking about research, this was the first grant I ever got as a fellow, which was an internal award. And this really helped to inform the competitiveness for the APA Young Investigator Award. So it's okay to start small, it can have a big impact and really serve as a bridge to building one's academic career. So we really sought to learn from our families and their experiences with food insecurity. Again, the recruitment for the study occurred in our primary care clinic for families presenting for a well child check. and identifying or reporting food insecurity were the eligibility criteria for the study. And in total, we were able to conduct 17 interviews in both English and Spanish. And these transcripts and this data was transcribed, double-coded, and analyzed to identify themes and sub-themes. And so the one big theme that we learned from our study was that there is a periodicity to food insecurity, and this can be very different for different family members and family units. So for this family, towards the end of the month, I don't know. I don't have as much to spend on food as I did at the beginning of the month. So here we see a periodicity on a monthly schedule. And then sometimes in the next example, we see a seasonality component to it, depending on the family's occupation. Sometimes when it's like the winter time, that work decreases a little, yes. And then understanding the severity of food insecurity and its relationship to other social drivers of health. To be honest, yes, we have periods where everything has come down on us. Well, I don't know, you see, if you do not have a car, well, then you cannot move. And if you do not have a family, that can't help you either. And so before, without a car, my husband could not go to work. And the last week of the month arrived, and we really had to adjust the food and payments and all that. Yes, we have had periods like that, as we say. And then again, highlighting these themes that these events, these experiences, these concepts do not occur in a vacuum. I had an appointment back in WIC where we got evicted, so I didn't get to make it to that appointment. I was trying to find a place to a safe place, and stable place for us to go, and I didn't have a chance to make that appointment. So a lot of data, a lot of studies, a lot of great research teams, and a lot of great interactions with the families that agree to participate in our studies. So what are we learning? Food insecurity is associated with differences in parental feeding behaviors, and these parental feeding behaviors may vary by race and ethnicity, so an important equity consideration. Food insecurity is dynamic, and its effect on health is dynamic as well, and there's a need to understand the longitudinal relationship between these exposures and these outcomes. And as we said before, the differential effects of food insecurity in different populations makes this a critical health equity issue, especially as the diversity of the parents and the families and children we care for in our clinic is increasing. Okay, so where do we go from here? Going up the steps. Don't worry, no child was hurt. I took this. So where are we going through here? So thinking about the drivers and how these are potentially related to one another, this, what I'm going to share with you is the lion's share of the work that I'm going to be completing as part of my K-23, and that's really to think about an intervention that works in primary care, but also asynchronously to really begin to address and support healthy weight gain among children. And this is a peer parent coach intervention. And so what are the concepts that's kind of informing the design and the eventual implementation of this program is thinking about some of the barriers that families might face as they're trying to support their infant. So some of the barriers hypothesized. So lack of familiarity with resources and needing assistance with resource connection. WIC is a fantastic program, and its participation rate across states and across individuals and across communities is not what we would like it to be, especially given its specifically designed role to support infant nutrition, family nutrition. And then lack of knowledge about pediatric obesity, food insecurity, infant feeding, and then also lack of social support. The last 4 years have been a really interesting time, and we see loneliness being talked about as a medical condition. And so I don't know about y'all, but sometimes having a young child, that can be a very isolating time, especially if there aren't other people in that same stage of life. So is there a role for our peer parent coach to operate in that space as well? And so what's the peer parent coach going to do? So thinking about rapport building with individuals and informed by some of the earlier lessons that we learned. Providing education, providing social support, providing resource connection and navigation. And then what are some of our early outcomes that we're going to be looking at? Feasibility and acceptability. Is this meeting the needs of the communities we hope to most impact and benefit and serve with these studies? And then we're also going to look at some of the clinical outcomes. Some of our secondary outcomes include change in the parental feeding behaviors, change in infant weight for length Z-scores, and family reported food insecurity. So I'm going to move on to the pediatric workforce. So equity in the pediatric workforce. Why is this important? I'm very excited about the discussion that will be happening next week about the fellowship I think this is a very important discussion for us to be having as a field, because as you'll see through our future talk, it relates back to equity in the pediatric workforce. So the diversity of children is increasing, and the diversity in the workforce can have a positive impact on health outcomes for children. However, we know that the diversity of the workforce is stagnant or not improving at the rate that we would like it to. And we are increasingly concerned about the size and the distribution of the workforce. Is the right workforce in the right location to care for the children as they are becoming increasingly diverse and have a very interesting geographical pattern? So I'm going to start at the beginning of residency. So this was the study where we looked at the educational debt of categorical pediatric residents after you take the ITE exam and you fill out the survey. This is where that data comes from. So thank you very much. It's been very helpful. We've taken your responses and have elevated them and brought them before key individuals. So we can see here a few things immediately jump out at us. Almost 20% report no educational debt, which is fantastic. However, we also see that that almost 44% of categorical first-year interns have reporting educational debt of over $200,000. And again, Victor, thank you so much for your help with this. And then how does educational debt relate? So educational debt is an equity issue for all disciplines in medicine. So taking a deeper look at educational debt and equity in pediatrics, a few things immediately jump out at us. So again, we have the different categories of educational debt, and we see that there are variations in the populations that are reporting educational debt. And so there's a lot of information on this slide. I will like to highlight the category of greater than $300,000 in debt. We see here that of those reporting $300,000 in debt, individuals identifying as Black represent approximately 33% of those individuals. And so how does the educational debt so the next thing, so we see educational debt's a problem. It's not affecting all populations the same. So what is the association, or what are possible associations between educational debt and the workforce? So here's a study where we looked at educational debt and the selection of the pediatric fellowship type. There's been a lot of great work by colleagues out at CHOP that have looked at how does your fellowship type or Gen Peds selection influence your earning potential over the course of your career. And so for this study, we dichotomized positive lifetime earners, negative lifetime earners, and then our exposure was our debt categories that we saw on the prior slide. And the big takeaway point here is there seems to be a threshold effect. And so once you get to about $200,000 and you go up, there are statistically significant odds of selecting a fellowship that has a positive lifetime earning. So there are, at the time of the study, we only included 14 subspecialties, and there are 3 that have a positive lifetime earning relative to a general pediatrician. Thanks, Victor. Great collaborator, by the way. You can see a lot of the work that we did together. So equity in the pediatric workforce. So the finances represent a potential barrier to cultivating a diverse workforce. And this is just going to compound existing barriers to having not just a diverse workforce, but a geographically distributed workforce. And then this led to the subspecialty project that I was very fortunate and very excited to be a part of. And this really sought and focused on anticipating child health needs as it relates to the pediatric subspecialty workforce from 2020 to 2040. So this is my funding and disclosures slide. It's very, very wordy. the American Board of Pediatric Foundation funded the project. This was in collaboration with the American Board of Pediatric Foundation, the UNC SEP Center, and the SMAD, the Strategic Modeling Analysts and Planning. And then what I'm going to discuss does not reflect the official views of these organizations. So this was a great collaborative project. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Leslie of the ABP, Dr. Fraher, who is a modeler and a health workforce expert based at SHEPS, And this team and the scale of this project really required expertise across multiple domains and multiple individuals. And as a health services research, it really opened my eyes into the complexities of teams, the complexities of data, and the importance of making sure, one, you have the proper personnel to successfully complete the project, and also making sure and insight into how to manage the team to meet deliverables. So what did we aim to do for this project? So we want to ensure that all children, infants, adolescents, and young adults have access to high quality, equitable pediatrics and specialty care, both now and in the future. And so to accomplish this aim, the goal was to develop a supply-based model of the 14 pediatric subspecialties currently certified at this time. Hospital medicine was not included due to not having enough data, and look at the projected number of individuals in the workforce and also their clinical contribution. So this was a really powerful model, required a lot of data, and was and really helped to advance the field of workforce by considering a few different elements. So of course, all workforce start with the current workforce, but we also looked at what does the current pathway into the pediatric subspecialty field broadly and within the individual subspecialties look like. Where do people move after training, or do they move? How do we account for people that might be exiting the workforce? What about individuals that are coming back into the workforce? And a big advancement of this model was not just looking at the number of individuals, but also thinking about what is their relative contribution of clinical time. Because subspecialists largely are based in large academic medical centers and urban centers where there's a lot of demands on our time that does not always directly relate to clinical care. So what is the actual clinical contribution of an individual in a given specialty? And so having the ability to separate this out by the 14 subspecialties is also a big advancement. If we did not do that, this would be our takeaway. This would be our takeaway from the study. 50% increase in total number of individuals in the pediatric subspecialty workforce, and their clinical contribution would increase 49% from 2020 to 2040. Everything's great. It's growth. It's big growth. These are big numbers. However, having the ability to stratify by the individual subspecialties paints a very, very different picture. So as you can see at the top, the neonatal, perinatal, the NICU cohort, they have the largest workforce in 2020, and they will continue to have the largest workforce in 2040. And then we look down at the closer to the bottom of this graph, we can see adolescent medicine, pediatric room, child abuse have very small workforces in 2020, and they are not anticipated to have substantial growth based on our modeling. So we know that the workforce has differential growth, but then what about the distribution of the workforce? Where are these individuals working? And so we have 4 census regions, and we have 9 divisions. And as part of this project, we were able to see what the relative growth and the current workforce is in each one of those divisions. And the reason why this is important is children are not projected to grow equally across these different census regions of the country. So I'm in North Carolina. So the South is expected to see a 20% increase in the child population. Children are moving to the South. Wake County is a very popular area to move in the state of North Carolina, and we're seeing similar migratory patterns for other states in the South. The West is also a census region that is seeing a tremendous increase in its child population, while we're not seeing the same magnitude when we look at the Midwest and the Northeast. However, when we look at the current distribution of the pediatric subspecialty workforce in its totality, based on this map, which is almost like a heat map, we see green in the Northeast, which based on our prior slide is not necessarily the region or a census region that's projected to have the most child growth. And so this is a screenshot of 2020. When we fast forward 2040, we see now the Northeast yellow, which indicates a higher density relative to other parts of the country. But as we saw previously, that's not where our projected areas of child growth are. So we're seeing a mismatch. So we might be training the individuals, but are they in the right location? So we have our data. Now we need to get it out. We need to share this with the relevant communities. And that led us to the pediatric supplement. Dr. Mary Leonard, thank you so much for all your help with this. And then this was also a multidisciplinary collaborative team because the individuals that assisted with this, assisted on this, all represent different pediatric specialties, and I was the generalist because generalists still play a role and have great implications for the pediatric subspecialty workforce. How many more conditions could we potentially manage in primary care? And so we were able to create a supplement, 19 articles in total. When I was entering all the authors into the submission portal, I think the final tally was 83. So thank you all for your contributions for that. And a special shout out, Dr. Mary Leonard, Dr. Christopher Russell, Dr. Mendoza, and Dr. I for your contributions. I didn't realize there was such a strong Stanford contingent in the supplement, but super glad to have that expertise. And so, as I said, there's 19 articles, and we do try to summarize what we perceive to be some of the take-home points of this. And this is contained in the article where we entitled "Projecting the Future Pediatric Subspecialty Workforce: Summary and Recommendations." And so we really try to break it down into individual domains. So, what are some of the recommendations from an education and training? Engage early. Provide exposure to the pediatric subspecialty workforce, not just in the inpatient. Inpatient medicine can look very different than the outpatient, and it's a different lifestyle. Thinking about practice and the expansion of telemedicine. Had a great conversation at dinner last night where there was a really fantastic conversation about having a Nevada license in order to provide care across states to meet the lack of subspecialty expertise for a given condition. And then having data informed metrics, using quality improvement methods to monitor our equity data to make sure that we're not worsening the disparities that we're seeing. Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement, and then thinking about loan repayment for the pediatric subspecialties. We're moving in the right direction, but the amount of clinical hours needed for the current loan program is a lot, especially in an academic medical center where there's other demands outside of clinical care. And then more data. We need more research to really help us understand what the actual needs are, where the needs are, and what the current makeup distribution of our workforce is, so that we can hopefully bring these into better alignment. Okay, very quickly, advocacy. So I'm very impressed by all my advocacy colleagues. I am not, this is not a strength of mine, but I really wanted to share this because I labeled this advocacy, but really for me, it was a sense of community. And what that community was the Academic Pediatric Association, where I've had the opportunity to interact and connect with incredible peers, incredible mentors, and inspirational individuals across the country. And this is one of the projects that Chris and I worked on together. And this was at the height of COVID. We were all we as individuals, institutions, organizations, were all kind of wrestling with how can we move this forward? How can we make not just statements, but how can we have tangible change? And so there were a few task force that came out of the APA. And as we were discussing this and being very thoughtful, very intentional about how we can implement sustainable change, I said, this is information that needs to be outside the APA because other organizations can learn from it. And so we were able to write these two commentaries in academic pediatrics. And I told you a shout out was coming. So, don't worry, Chris, there's more coming. Continuing the conversation. So for all of y'all that are coming to Toronto for PAS, I look forward to seeing y'all. And I just want to make a shout out that we have a few esteemed Stanford faculty that will be there, and they will be talking about the end of affirmative action, conversations on the current and future of DEI in pediatrics. And I did not realize this until I was making the slide that this is May the 4th. So all of you Star Wars fans out there. And so we've talked about a lot. We've made a lot of progress, but a lot of work remains to be done. And I was encouraged by my mentors and individuals that I practiced a slide around that said, what's the take home point? Like what can we do? These are big problems. These are macro problems. What can we do? Like give them something tangible to walk away with. And I was like, that's a really good point. So this is my attempt to do that. So thinking, what can we as individuals do? I'm going to get the punchline first, and it's be present and be attentive. So this article I wrote with my fellows during my fellowship, and I had an amazing fellowship class. It was myself and two individuals who identify as Black women, and I was like, this is incredible diversity for a pediatric fellowship. How did we all get here? And how are we all able to like meet our professional needs? And we kind of met and we talked about it, and we're like, there aren't too many people that share our lived experience or have our the same concordance as us, but we still find community here. And so we wrote this article, and it really wanted to drive home the point that it takes a diversity of mentorship to increase diversity. And some of the shared characteristics that we saw of the people that we met with and interacted with and collaborated with was, although there wasn't necessarily a same lived experience, there was a desire to listen, desire to understand, a desire to acknowledge the differences in our lived experience and some of the stresses that we face as individuals, but still being very committed to supporting us in that. So I hope that's a good take-home point. I hope that's inspirational. And then here's my acknowledgements. So many people within pediatrics and across medicine, and even outside of medicine, research, academic medicine is a team sport. I've been incredibly thankful and fortunate to have such an incredible group of people that I'm able to work with. And I thank you all for your attention, and happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk. We have a few minutes for questions. We can start with, there's one on Zoom, and so we'll start with that one as people come up to, and we were talking about your K-23 project, and sort of someone asked, how do you foresee community health workers playing a role in that model? Do you feel like you're going to be able to integrate them?
Yeah, so that is a fantastic question. And I think there's a need for us to expand the workforce in primary care and utilize different individuals who have different expertise. So I think there is a role for community health workers, and I think having them paired with the peer parents can be can work synergistically, because there is a need or potentially desire for acknowledgement of that lived experience and providing that social support, which might be better delivered by someone that is in a similar life stage or recently in that life stage, where the community health worker can really provide expertise in resource connection and knowledge of local resource, knowledge of community resources. So I think that there are multiple opportunities for multiple individuals and with complementary expertise to support our families that really need this care and would benefit from this care the most.
Hi, Colin. Thank you so much for that excellent grand rounds. My name is Carrie Rosbeck, and I'm the residency program director here. So I poured over the supplement that just came out. So thank you for that work. That is incredibly helpful. And one of the things that I was struck by is some of the data about the projected workforce needs and what are the implications for residency training programs today. So what we're seeing in our children's hospital is an increasing census. There's some data that shows that that is a national trend as well. And we're trying to find the right balance between growing our resident workforce, which is the future primary care and pediatric subspecialty workforce, and then also looking at other types of providers, for example, APPs. I'm curious what you have in mind after doing all of that work in terms of how do we project the right workforce and think about residency training needs today and in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. And unfortunately, I don't think that there's one succinct answer. But I do think that an awareness of it is essential. We need more data to think about. We need more data to inform our understanding and our decisions. We looked at supply for this side, but we need to understand what are the demands in terms of child health needs. But I do think a consistent theme that we did see across the supplement was having allied members augment our workforce. And so I think that there are opportunities to collaborate with allied providers to help with the clinical needs, especially for residents, so that they can meet their needs, not get burned out, but still help advance their learning. Because learning does not stop in residency, it continues long after, and we want to make sure we're not burning people out or taking away those critical learning opportunities. But great question.
Thank you so much.
Great talk in both areas. For the first area of obesity, one of the things that has come out in some of the research is that at the end of the day, as you pointed out, certain groups have higher rates. And among Hispanics, the question I would raise to you, what is the family structure that may influence that? So that while we think it's a two-parent situation, being a grandparent now, I know grandparents have an influence. And at the end of the day, I'm wondering whether, as you address the issue of influencing the family, should you also think about what other groups fit into that context of family?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. And that is spot on. We need to, who we see in the clinic may not be the entirety of the child's support network. And thinking about how do we connect with the people and the caregivers that aren't in the room, and what is the relationship to the people that we are seeing. From like some vaccine work, we frequently see people being like, I need to ask grandma if we can do the flu vaccine or if we can do the COVID. So there's a power dynamic that's unseen to us. But I think it takes time to understand that power dynamic, and will only make itself known if there's trust and rapport. And I'm hoping that the peer parent coaches will be able to have that continuity, that shared lived experience, really unearth that, so to help us inform how we interact with the family. But that's a critical part of caring for the child, is understanding their larger environment.
One last question / suggestion on the chat was, have you considered, I'm going to expand it, like other pediatrics who are not physician or medical physician specialties, like dentistry? We think about our occupational therapists or psychologists, how we think about the workforce, just an opportunity to think about all the other people who help support physicians as they care for children, and thinking about equity in that work as well.
Yeah, pediatricians cannot address or solve these problems alone, and having those allied workforces and understanding their needs and their relationship with pediatricians and other pediatric providers is essential. And so if there are other ideas of projects that we could potentially do, please reach out. I'm always interested in collaborating and thinking about how we can use data to inform policy to impact health. So appreciate the question.
And I just want to close by saying, Colin, you're an example of really the collaborative nature of pediatrics. And I think more than many people that I've worked and collaborated with in the past, you've really brought together a large group of people to really positively affect change. And so I just want to say that in front of everyone. And I think with that, we'll close. And thank you so much again for your talk and your time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.